The silence that followed was deafening. 23 people around our Thanksgiving table had just witnessed my father deliver what he thought was the final blow to my dreams. But what happened next changed everything, not just for me, but for our entire family. The woman sitting 3 seats down from my dad slowly stood up. When she spoke, her words would turn our world upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The whole mess started 3 weeks before Thanksgiving 2019. I was living in a cramped studio apartment in Denver, Colorado, working as a freelance graphic designer and barely making ends meet. At 26, I was still trying to figure out my place in the world while watching my college friends climb corporate ladders and buy houses. My parents, especially my father, Robert Garrison, had made it crystal clear that they viewed my career choices as nothing more than expensive hobbies. Robert Garrison was a man who measured success in dollars and traditional milestones. He'd built his plumbing supply business from the ground up, starting with a single truck and ending up with 3 locations across the Denver metro area. To him, success meant steady paychecks, benefits, and a clear path forward. My graphic design work, with its irregular income and creative focus, might as well have been finger painting. The tension had been building for months. Every family gathering became a battlefield where my father would find new ways to express his disappointment. During my cousin Sarah's wedding in August, he'd introduce me to other guests as my son Marcus, who's still trying to figure things out. At my sister's birthday dinner in September, he'd suggested I look into real jobs with the city or maybe consider going back to school for something practical. But it was the phone call 3 weeks before Thanksgiving that really set the stage for what was coming. I'd been excited to share some good news. I'd just landed a contract with a local brewery to design their entire rebrand, including their logo, packaging, and marketing materials. It was my biggest project yet, worth more than I'd made in the previous 3 months combined. "Dad, I got some great news," I'd said when he picked up the phone. "Let me guess, another one of your art projects?" His voice carried that familiar tone of weary resignation. I pressed on anyway. "Actually, it's a major contract with Mountain Peak Brewing. They want me to completely redesign their brand identity. It's going to pay really well, and if it goes, well, they're talking about bringing me on for their expansion into 3 new states." There was a pause. "Marcus, when are you going to stop fooling around with this stuff? You're almost 30. Your sister Jessica already has her own house and a promotion at the bank. Your cousin Tom just became a partner at his law firm. And here you are, still playing with computer graphics like you're in high school." The words stung, but they weren't new. What caught me off guard was what came next. "Look, I didn't want to do this over the phone, but maybe it's better this way. Your mother and I have been talking, and we think you need some tough love. We're not going to keep enabling this fantasy of yours. No more help with rent when you come up short. No more family loans. And honestly, Marcus, I'm embarrassed too. Tell people what you do for work." That last sentence hit like a physical blow. I'd always known my father wasn't proud of my career, but hearing him say he was embarrassed by me was something else entirely. "I thought maybe you'd grow out of this phase by now," he continued, "but it's clear you're not going to face reality on your own, so we're going to help you face it." I hung up the phone and spent the next hour staring at the wall of my apartment. The Mountain Peak Brewing contract suddenly felt meaningless. All the late nights, all the client meetings, all the creative breakthroughs, none of it mattered. If my own father saw it as nothing more than an expensive waste of time, but something inside me refused to give up. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was genuine belief in what I was doing, but I threw myself into the brewery project with everything I had. I spent 18-hour days perfecting every detail, researching their target market, understanding their brand story, and creating designs that didn't just look good, told their story in a way that would connect with customers. The client presentation went better than I could have hoped. The owners of Mountain Peak Brewing, David and Linda Hartley, were thrilled with the concepts. They immediately approved the full package and started talking about the expansion work. More importantly, they introduced me to some of their business partners who were interested in similar branding work. Within 2 weeks of that devastating phone call with my father, I had more work lined up than I'd ever had before. The Mountain Peak project had opened doors I didn't even know existed. A tech startup wanted me to design their investor presentation materials. A local restaurant chain was interested in a complete rebrand. A nonprofit organization reached out about creating their annual report design. For the first time since I'd started freelancing, felt like I was building something real. The work was challenging, the pay was good, and most importantly, I could see a clear path forward. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was actually thriving, but none of that seemed to matter when Thanksgiving rolled around. The Garrison family. Thanksgiving was always a production. My mother Patricia would spend days preparing enough food to feed a small army. The guest list typically included my parents, my sister Jessica and her husband Mike, my Aunt Carol, and Uncle Frank. Their 3 kids, including my cousin Tom, the lawyer, my grandmother Eleanor, and a rotating cast of family, friends, and distant relatives. This year, the group was larger than usual. My Aunt Carol had invited her new business partner, a woman named Victoria Chen, along with her husband and teenage daughter. My mother had also invited the Johnsons, longtime family friends, whose daughter had just graduated from business school. Add in a few more cousins and family friends, and we had 23 people crammed around tables that had been pushed together to accommodate everyone. I'd been dreading the gathering for weeks, knowing that my father would find some way to bring up my career, or lack thereof, in his opinion. What I hadn't expected was how the conversation would unfold. Everything started normally enough. We went around the table, sharing what we were thankful for.
Oh.
My sister talked about her recent promotion to branch manager at the bank. My cousin Tom mentioned making partner at his law firm. My grandmother shared her gratitude for good health at 84, the usual mix of family updates and gratitude. When it came to my turn, I kept it simple, thankful for the opportunity to do work that I love and for the support of family and friends. I thought I'd managed to avoid controversy, but my father had other plans. Work that you love, he repeated, his voice carrying an edge that made several people at the table look up from their plates. That's an interesting way to put it, Marcus. Adele? My mother shot him a warning look, but he was already committed to whatever path he'd decided to take. You know, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, he continued, setting down his fork and turning to address not just me, but the entire table. We live in a society that tells young people to follow their dreams, to do what makes them happy. But sometimes I wonder if we're doing them a disservice. The conversation around the table had quieted. Everyone could sense the tension building. Take Marcus here, my father said, gesturing toward me. He's 26 years old, still living in that tiny apartment, still chasing this dream of being an artist or designer or whatever he calls it. And we've all been very supportive, very encouraging. But maybe that's been the problem. I felt my face flush. Dad, this isn't really the time or place. No, actually, I think it is the time and place, he interrupted, because I've been watching. You struggle for years now, and I've been too polite to say what everyone at this table is thinking. The silence was crushing. I could feel 22 pairs of eyes on me, waiting to see how this would play out. What's everyone's thinking? I managed to ask. My father leaned back in his chair, his expression a mixture of frustration and what he probably thought was tough love. Marcus, you're never going to amount to anything with this graphic design nonsense. You're nearly 30 years old, and you're still living like a college student. You don't have a real job. You don't have benefits. You don't have security. You're one bad month away from having to move back in with us. The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. It was one thing for him to express disappointment in private phone calls, but to humiliate me in front of the entire extended family was something else entirely. I know you think you're being creative and following your passion, he continued, but passion doesn't pay the bills. Passion doesn't build a future. And honestly, I'm tired of watching you waste your potential on something that's never going to provide for you or a family. I looked around the table, seeing a mixture of expressions, some sympathetic, some uncomfortable, some nodding in agreement with my father. My sister Jessica looked mortified. My mother was staring at her plate. My grandmother was watching the whole scene with sharp eyes that missed nothing. But it was the woman sitting 3 seats down from my father who caught my attention. Victoria Chen, my aunt's business partner, was watching the exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read. She was probably in her early 50s, professionally dressed even for a family dinner, with the kind of composed presence that suggested she was used to being in charge of situations. "You know what, Marcus?" my father said, his voice getting louder and more certain. "I love you, but I'm done pretending that what you're doing is anything more than an expensive hobby. It's time to grow up, get a real job, and start building a life instead of just drifting through one." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. I opened my mouth to respond, to defend myself, to say something, anything that might salvage some dignity from the situation. But before I could speak, Victoria Chen slowly pushed back her chair and stood up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but carrying enough authority that everyone at the table immediately turned to look at her. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing this conversation, and I think there might be something you should know." Victoria Chen remained standing, her presence commanding the attention of everyone at the table. She reached into her purse and pulled out a sleek business card, placing it gently on the table in front of my father. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Robert, I believe you said your son would never amount to anything with his graphic design work?" Her tone was measured, professional, but there was something underneath it that made everyone lean forward slightly. My father glanced at the business card. I watched his expression change from confident dismissal to confusion, then to something approaching shock. "Victoria Chen, Chief Executive Officer, Pacific Digital Solutions," he read aloud, his voice suddenly much quieter than it had been moments before. Victoria nodded. "One of the largest creative and marketing agencies on the West Coast. We have offices in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, and as of last month, Denver." She paused, letting that information settle. "We specialize in brand development, digital marketing, and creative solutions for Fortune 500 companies." The table had gone completely silent. Even my 5-year-old nephew had stopped playing with his food. "I'm curious, Robert," Victoria continued. "What exactly do you think graphic design is?" My father opened his mouth, then closed it again. He clearly hadn't expected to be put on the spot by someone he'd assumed was just another family friend. "Well, I mean, it's making pictures on computers, isn't it? Logos and advertisements and that sort of thing." Victoria smiled, but it wasn't entirely friendly. "Marcus, would you mind if I shared some information about the project you completed for Mountain Peak Brewing?" I felt my heart skip. How could she possibly know about that project? I hadn't mentioned it to anyone at the table, and the work had only been completed 2 weeks ago. "How do you know about Mountain Peak?" I asked. "David Hartley is a personal friend of mine. Went to business school together at Stanford. Called me last week, absolutely raving about the work you'd done for his company. Said it was the most comprehensive and strategically sound brand development he'd seen in years." My Aunt Carol was staring at her business partner with wide eyes. "Victoria, you never mentioned David was so impressed," Victoria continued, "that he sent me your portfolio. Marcus, I've been in this industry for 22 years. I've worked with some of the most talented designers and strategists in the country. Your work for Mountain Peak wasn't just graphic design, it was strategic brand architecture at the highest level." She turned back to my father, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Robert, your son didn't just create a pretty logo. He conducted market research, analyzed demographic data, developed a complete visual identity system, created packaging designs that will increase shelf appeal, and built a brand strategy that positioned Mountain Peak for expansion into new markets. That's not arts and crafts, that's high-level business consulting with a creative execution." The revelation was hitting the table in waves. I could see family members processing this information, their expressions shifting as they realized they'd been witnessing something very different from what they'd initially thought. "The brewery project alone," Victoria said, generated what I estimate to be about $40,000 in value for Mountain Peak. The new branding has already resulted in a 15% increase in sales, and they haven't even launched the expansion campaign yet. $40,000. I'd charged them $8,000 for the project, thinking I was being aggressive with my pricing. The idea that I'd created $40,000 in value was staggering. My father was staring at Victoria's business card like it might bite him. I had no idea that that graphic design could be a legitimate lucrative career. Victoria's voice had an edge now. Robert, the creative industry generates over $700 billion annually in the United States alone. Companies like Apple, Nike, Coca-Cola spend millions on brand development because they understand that strategic design directly impacts their bottom line. She reached into her purse again and pulled out her phone. Marcus, I hope you don't mind, but David shared some images of your work with me. May I show the table? I nodded, still trying to process what was happening. Victoria swiped through her phone and then held it up so everyone could see the screen. This is the before and after of Mountain Peak Brewing's brand identity, she announced. On the left is their old logo and packaging. On the right is Marcus's redesign. Even from where I was sitting, I could see the dramatic difference. My redesign looked professional, modern, and sophisticated compared to the brewery's previous amateur-looking materials. The old design, Victoria explained, looked like something created in Microsoft Word. The new design positions Mountain Peak as a premium craft brewery that can compete with established brands. That's the difference between decoration and strategy. My sister Jessica was the first to speak up. Marcus, I had no idea your work looked like this. This is incredible. It gets better, Victoria said, putting her phone away. David told me that within a week of launching the new branding, Mountain Peak received inquiries from 2 major distributors who had previously ignored them. The visual impact of professional design opened doors that had been closed to them. For years, my Uncle Frank, who'd been quietly listening, finally chimed in. So you're saying Marcus's work actually helps businesses make more money? Substantially more money, Victoria confirmed. Good design isn't about making things pretty. It's about making them effective. Marcus's work for Mountain Peak will likely generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional revenue over the next few years. The mood at the table was shifting dramatically. People who had been nodding along with my father's criticism were now looking at me with new interest and respect, but Victoria wasn't finished. Robert, you mentioned that Marcus doesn't have a real job or security. I'm curious, what do you consider job security in today's economy? My father was clearly wishing this conversation had never started, but he was trapped now. Well, steady paycheck benefits, a clear career path. Like working for a single employer who could lay you off at any time, Victoria asked. Marcus has multiple clients, multiple revenue streams, and skills that are in high demand across every industry. If one client disappears, he has others. If the market changes, he can adapt. That's not instability, that's anti-fragility. She turned to address the entire table. The traditional model of job security, working for one company for 30 years, is largely extinct. The most successful professionals today are those who can provide specialized value to multiple clients. Exactly like Marcus is doing. My grandmother, Eleanor, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, suddenly spoke up. Doria, dear, what exactly are you suggesting? Victoria looked at my grandmother, then at me, then back at my father, suggesting that Robert has fundamentally misunderstood both his son's work and his son's prospects. Marcus isn't struggling. He's building something. She paused, and when she continued, her words would change everything. In fact, I've been looking for someone exactly like Marcus to lead our new Denver office. Someone with his combination of strategic thinking, creative execution, and client relationship skills. The position starts at $120,000 annually, plus equity participation, full benefits, and the opportunity to build a team. The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This was the silence of 23 people trying to process information that had just turned their understanding of the situation completely upside down. My mother was the first to recover. Victoria, are you offering Marcus a job? Offering him a career opportunity that recognizes the value he's already creating, Victoria replied. Though I should mention, based on his current client roster and the quality of his work, he might be better off continuing to freelance. The income potential is actually higher. I felt like I was in a dream. An hour ago, I'd been the family. Disappointment, the son who couldn't get his life together. Now I was being offered a six-figure job by a CEO who understood exactly what I'd been trying to build. But the most satisfying moment came when I looked at my father's face and saw something I'd never seen before, genuine surprise, mixed with what looked like the beginning of respect. My father sat frozen, staring at Victoria's business card as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. The confident man who had been lecturing me about reality just minutes earlier had vanished, placed by someone who looked genuinely shaken. "Robert," my mother said softly, reaching over to touch his arm. "Maybe you should wait," he interrupted, his voice hoarse. He looked up at Victoria, then at me, then back at Victoria. "Are you serious about this job offer?" Victoria's expression remained professional but firm, completely serious. Though, as I mentioned, Marcus might want to consider whether employment is the right path for him at this stage. My cousin Tom, the lawyer who had been mentioned earlier as a success story, leaned forward with obvious interest. "What do you mean by that?" "Well," Victoria said, settling back into her chair, "let's do some quick math. Marcus charged $8,000 for the Mountain Peak project, which took him approximately 3 weeks of focused work. That's roughly $138,000 annually if he maintained that pace in pricing. Frankly, based on the quality of his work, he's undercharging significantly." She pulled out her phone again. "I did some research on comparable projects in major markets. A brand identity overhaul of that scope typically runs between $15,000 and $30,000 from an established agency. Marcus delivered premium work at a fraction of market rate. Not painful ones, revelatory ones. I'd been so focused on just surviving, on proving I could make it work, that I'd never stopped to calculate what I might actually be worth. But there's more," Victoria continued. "The referrals from Mountain Peak are already generating additional opportunities. David mentioned that Marcus has been contacted by 3 other businesses in the past 2 weeks. If he scales his pricing appropriately and builds a proper client pipeline, his income potential far exceeds what I could offer him as an employee." My Uncle Frank, who owned a small construction company, was nodding thoughtfully. "So you're saying he could make more money on his own than working for you?" "Potentially much more," Victoria confirmed. "The creative services industry rewards talent and expertise at premium rates. A skilled freelancer with Marcus's capabilities could easily generate $200,000 to $300,000 annually within a few years. $200,000 to $300,000. The number seemed absurd. 6 months ago, I'd been celebrating a $1,000 project. As a major victory, my Aunt Carol was looking between Victoria and me with a mixture of pride and amazement. "Victoria, how long have you known about Marcus's work?" "David first mentioned him about 10 days ago," Victoria replied. "When Carol invited us to dinner tonight, I had no idea we'd be meeting the same Marcus that David had been raving about. It wasn't until I heard his name and saw his reaction to the business discussion that I put the pieces together." She turned to address my father directly. "Robert, I want you to understand something. In my 22 years in this industry, I've seen thousands of portfolios.
Nice.
I've hired hundreds of designers and creative professionals. What your son has accomplished, working entirely on his own without formal agency training or mentorship, is genuinely exceptional." My father's face was going through a complex series of expressions. I could see him trying to reconcile everything he thought he knew about my career with the information he was receiving. "But he's been struggling," he said, his voice much quieter. "Now, living in that tiny apartment, worrying about paying rent." "He's been building," Victoria corrected. "There's a difference between struggling and investing in your future. Every successful entrepreneur goes through a phase where they're operating on thin margins while they establish their reputation and client base. That's not failure. That's the natural progression of building something valuable." My sister Jessica, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Marcus, why didn't you ever tell us about projects like Mountain Peak? I mean, really tell us. Explain what you were actually doing." It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself. "I guess I was tired of having to justify my work," I said. Every time I tried to explain a project, it felt like I was being defensive. It was easier to just say I was working and leave. "It at that, but you were doing incredible work," Jessica pressed. "This Mountain Peak stuff, it's like real business work, important work." Victoria nodded approvingly. That's exactly right. Strategic design is business work. When Marcus redesigned Mountain Peak's brand, he wasn't just making things look nice, he was solving business problems. How do you differentiate your product in a crowded market? How do you communicate quality and authenticity? Appeal to your target demographic while remaining accessible to new customers. Those are complex business challenges that require both analytical thinking and creative execution. My grandmother, Eleanor, who had been observing everything with her characteristic sharp attention, finally weighed in. Victoria, dear, I have a question. If Marcus's work is as valuable as you're suggesting, why has he been having financial difficulties? It was the kind of direct question my grandmother was known for, cutting straight to the heart of apparent contradictions. Victoria smiled. That's an excellent question, Eleanor. There are several factors at play. First, Marcus has been significantly underpricing his work, common for talented people who don't yet understand their market value. Second, he's been working with smaller clients who have limited budgets, rather than targeting businesses that can afford premium services. Third, and most importantly, he's been operating without the business development systems that would generate consistent, high-value opportunities. She gestured toward me. Marcus has the creative and strategic skills to compete at the highest levels. What he needs now is business mentorship, understanding how to price his services, how to identify and attract premium clients, and how to scale his operations efficiently. Which brings me back to my offer, Victoria continued. Pacific Digital Solutions wouldn't just be a job, it would be a masterclass in high-level creative business operations. Marcus would be leading projects for Fortune 500 companies, managing teams of specialists, and learning how the industry operates at scale. The conversation was moving so fast that I felt like I was watching it happen to someone else. An hour ago, I'd been the family disappointment. Now I was being discussed as a potential executive at a major agency. But my father wasn't finished processing everything. Victoria, I need to ask you something directly. Are you just being polite because we're at a family dinner? Are you exaggerating? Marcus's abilities to spare his feelings. The question hung in the air, and I realized that part of me was wondering the same thing. Was this all too good to be true? Victoria's expression grew serious. Robert, I'm going to be very direct with you. I don't do charity work when it comes to business decisions. If I offer someone a position at my company, it's because I believe they can contribute significantly to our success. If I tell you that your son's work is exceptional, it's because I've seen his portfolio and compared it to industry standards. She reached into her purse and pulled out a tablet. Would you like me to show you some examples of work that we typically charge $50,000 to $80,000 for, so you can compare it to what Marcus accomplished for $8,000? My father nodded, still looking somewhat dazed. Victoria swiped through several images on her tablet, showing sleek brand identities and marketing campaigns. The work was undeniably professional and sophisticated, but honestly, it wasn't dramatically better than what I'd created for Mountain Peak. These projects, Victoria said, represent the kind of work we do for major corporate clients. Technically, excellent, strategically sound, professionally executed. Marcus's Mountain Peak project meets or exceeds these standards in every category. The implications were sinking in around the table. If Victoria was right, I hadn't just been surviving as a freelancer. I'd been creating work that could compete with major agencies, while charging a fraction of what the market would bear. My father set down the tablet and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't quite admiration, but it was something close to awe, mixed with what looked like regret. The weight of my father's gaze felt different now. Gone was the dismissive disappointment I'd grown accustomed to over the years. Its place was something I couldn't quite identify, confusion perhaps, mixed with what looked like the beginning of understanding. Marcus, he said slowly, I owe you an apology. The words hung in the air, and I felt something shift inside my chest. It wasn't the triumphant vindication I might have imagined in my daydreams. Instead, it was more complicated, relief mixed, with sadness for all the years of misunderstanding. Dad, you don't know. I do, he interrupted, his voice stronger now. I've spent years thinking I was helping you by pushing you toward what I thought was stability. But I was operating from complete ignorance about what you actually do." Victoria had settled back in her chair, watching the family dynamics play out with the kind of professional interest that suggested she'd seen similar situations before. My mother reached over and squeezed my father's hand. "Robert, we both made assumptions. We didn't understand Marcus's work because we didn't ask the right questions." "It's more than that, Patricia," my father said. I was actively dismissive. I treated his career like it was a phase he needed to grow out of, instead of trying to understand what he was building. My cousin Tom leaned forward, his legal training evident in how he was processing the information. "Marcus, I have to ask, if you're capable of this level of work, why haven't you been charging more? Victoria's numbers suggest you could have been making significantly more money all along." It was a question I'd been wrestling with myself, as Victoria had laid out the financial realities. Honestly, imposter syndrome probably. When you're working alone, without industry mentorship or peer comparison, it's hard to know what your work is actually worth. I was so focused on just getting clients and proving I could do the work that I never stopped to research what established professionals charge. Victoria nodded knowingly. It's incredibly common in creative industries. Talented people often undervalue themselves because they focus on the creative process rather than the business outcome. Marcus was thinking about the time he spent designing, not the value he was creating for his clients. "But there's another factor," I continued, looking around the table. "When your own family questions whether your work is legitimate, it's hard to have confidence in pricing it at premium rates." I internalized a lot of the doubt about whether what I was doing was real work. The admission seemed to hit my father particularly hard. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they looked pained. "Marcus, I need you to know something," he said. "My concerns weren't really about your work. They were about my own fears when I built the plumbing supply business. I followed a very traditional path: steady growth, predictable income, clear metrics for success. Your path looked so different from mine that I couldn't evaluate it properly." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I was afraid you were going to struggle the way I struggled in the early years of my business. But I forgot that every successful business starts with someone taking a risk on something that doesn't look like traditional employment." My Aunt Carol, who had been quietly listening to her business partner's revelations about my work, suddenly spoke up. "Victoria, I have to ask, how common is this kind of misunderstanding about creative work?" "Extremely common," Victoria replied. "I'd estimate that 70% of the most talented freelancers I've met are significantly undervaluing their services, often because they lack business context or family support for their career choices. The creative industries have a perception problem. People see the output, but don't understand the strategic thinking and business impact behind it." She turned to address my father directly. "Robert, your son didn't just design a logo for Mountain Peak Brewing. He conducted market research to understand their competitive landscape. He analyzed their target demographics to determine optimal visual communication strategies. He developed a comprehensive brand architecture that positions them for expansion, created packaging designs that will influence purchasing decisions. That's high-level business consulting with creative execution. It's exactly the kind of work that Fortune 500 companies pay premium rates for." My sister Jessica was shaking her head in amazement. "Marcus, I had no idea you were doing research and strategy work. When you said you were working on designs, I pictured you just making things look pretty." "That's part of the problem with how we talk about creative work," I said. "When I tell people I'm a graphic designer, they think about making flyers or business cards. But most of my projects involve weeks of research, strategy development, and business analysis before I ever start the visual design phase." My uncle Frank, whose construction business had given him experience with project management and client relations, was nodding thoughtfully. "So it's more like architectural work. You can't just start building without understanding the site, the requirements, the regulations, all the underlying factors." "That's a perfect analogy," Victoria said. You're building something that has to function effectively in a complex environment, serve multiple purposes, and deliver measurable results. My grandmother Eleanor, who had been listening with characteristic attention to detail, raised a question that cut to the heart of everything. Victoria, dear, if Marcus's work is as valuable as you're suggesting, what would you advise him to do differently going forward? Victoria's expression grew more serious, shifting into what I recognized as executive mode. That's an excellent question, Eleanor. Marcus is at a critical juncture in his career development. He's proven he can deliver premium quality work, but he needs to make some strategic decisions about how to scale and position himself. She began ticking off points on her fingers. First, pricing restructure. Based on market standards and the quality of his work, Marcus should be charging $15,000 to $30,000 for projects like Mountain Peak, not $8,000. Second, client targeting. He needs to focus on businesses that have both the budget and the sophistication to value strategic design work. Third, business development systems, consistent processes for generating high-quality leads and managing the sales pipeline. Fourth, she continued, positioning and credibility building. Marcus needs case studies, testimonials, and a professional presence that communicates his expertise to potential clients. Fifth, potentially most important, he needs to decide whether to continue as a solo practitioner or build an agency. The conversation was moving into territory I'd never really considered. I'd been so focused on project-to-project survival that I'd never developed a long-term strategic vision for my career. I asked Victoria, considered the question carefully. Honestly, both paths have significant advantages. Solo practice offers higher profit margins and complete creative control, but limits your capacity and growth potential. Agency building offers scalability and market impact, requires different skills, and involves more complex business management. She paused, looking around the table. However, there's a third option that might be optimal for Marcus's current situation. A hybrid approach, maintaining independence while building strategic partnerships with established agencies for larger projects. It would allow him to command premium rates while learning agency-level business operations. My father, who had been following the conversation with intense focus, suddenly asked, Victoria, what kind of support would Marcus need to implement these changes? The question surprised me. An hour ago, my father dismissed my career entirely. Now he was asking about what I'd need to succeed at a higher level. Primarily business mentorship and industry connections, Victoria replied. Marcus has the creative and strategic capabilities to compete at any level. What he needs is guidance on business development, pricing strategy, and market positioning, plus access to higher-level opportunities than he's been finding on his own. She looked at me with a slight smile, which, coincidentally, is exactly what working with Pacific Digital Solutions would provide, even on a consulting basis, rather than as a full-time employee. My mother, who had been quietly processing everything, finally spoke up. Marcus, honey, what do you want to do? This is a lot to consider. It was a fair question, and one I didn't have an immediate answer for. The conversation had reframed everything. I thought I knew about my career trajectory. The financial possibilities Victoria had outlined were beyond anything I'd imagined. But they also represented a level of business sophistication I wasn't sure I was ready for. I need time to think about all this, I said honestly. A few hours ago, I thought I was barely making it as a freelancer. Now I'm being told I could potentially build a six-figure business or take an executive position at a major agency. A lot to process. Victoria nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right response. These kinds of career decisions shouldn't be made impulsively. Take time to research the options, maybe speak with some other professionals in the industry, and understand what each path would require. She reached into her purse and pulled out another business card, this one with handwritten notes on the back. Marcus, here's my direct contact information. Whether you're interested in the position at Pacific Digital, consulting opportunities, or just industry mentorship, I'd be happy to continue the conversation. David Hartley speaks very highly of you, and based on what I've seen tonight, I think you have exceptional potential. My father was staring at the business card as Victoria handed it to me. Marcus, I want you to know that whatever you decide, you have my complete support. I clearly didn't understand what you were building, and I'm sorry for that. Paused, looking around the table at our extended family. Actually, I owe everyone here an apology. I turned what should have been a celebration of family into a criticism session based on my own ignorance. That was inappropriate and unfair. The admission seemed to release some of the tension that had been building throughout the evening. My mother squeezed his hand again. My sister smiled encouragingly. Even my usually stoic Uncle Frank nodded approvingly. But it was my grandmother's response that surprised me most.
Now, Robert,
she said in her clear, authoritative voice, I think. There's something else you need to understand about this situation. Everyone turned to look at her, curious about what additional insight she might offer. Marcus, she continued, turning to face me directly, how long have you been doing this kind of work? Not just the Mountain Peak project, but strategic design. Work in general? I thought about it. It's probably about 3 years, though the more sophisticated projects have been in the last 18 months. My grandmother nodded slowly. And in that time, working entirely on your own, you've developed skills that a major agency CEO considers exceptional. You've created work that generates substantial value for your clients. You've built a reputation that leads to referrals and opportunities. She paused, looking around the table with the kind of authority that comes from 8 decades of observing human nature. That's not luck, she said firmly. That's not an accident. That's talent, combined with dedication, combined with the kind of persistence that builds successful careers. Robert, your son didn't stumble into this success, he earned it. The observation hit me harder than any of the financial projections or career opportunities that had been discussed. My grandmother had distilled the entire evening down to its essential truth. I hadn't been failing or struggling or wasting time. I'd been building something valuable, even when no one around me understood what I was creating. The weeks following that Thanksgiving dinner unfolded like scenes from a completely different life than the one I'd been living. Victoria had been serious about everything she'd said. And within 3 days of our family gathering, I found myself in downtown Denver at the Pacific Digital Solutions office, sitting in a conference room that overlooked the mountains and cost. More to furnish than I'd made in the past 6 months. Marcus, I want to show you something, Victoria said, pulling up a presentation on the massive wall-mounted display. This is what we charge for a project that's remarkably similar to your Mountain Peak work. The number on the screen made me blink twice. $47,000. The client was a regional wine distributor looking to rebrand for national expansion. Similar scope, similar market dynamics, similar strategic challenges. The main difference? They had the budget to pay market rates for the work. I stared at the comparison Victoria had created between my Mountain Peak project and their wine distributor rebrand. The quality was comparable, the strategic depth was similar, and if anything, my work showed more innovation in the execution. Question, Victoria continued, is whether you want to continue undervaluing your services, or whether you're ready to position yourself appropriately in the market. Over the past few days, I'd been doing research on creative industry pricing, and the numbers were both encouraging and terrifying. Victoria hadn't been exaggerating. I'd been charging roughly 25% of market rates for work that exceeded industry standards. Before we talk about specific opportunities, Victoria said, I want you to understand something important. The conversation at your family dinner revealed a pattern I see constantly in this industry. Talented creative professionals often struggle. Not because they lack ability, but because they lack business context and market positioning. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a diagram of what she called the creative professional development curve. Most designers start here. She pointed to the left side of the curve, focused purely on creative execution. They charge low rates because they're thinking about their time input, not their value output. The ones who succeed long-term move. Through this middle phase, she traced the curve upward, where they begin understanding business strategy and client outcomes. Finally, the most successful creative professionals reach this level. She indicated the top of the curve, where they're essentially business consultants who happen to execute through design. I could see exactly where I'd been positioned on that curve, somewhere in the middle, starting to understand business strategy, but still pricing like I was purely a creative executor. Marcus, based on your Mountain Peak work in the strategic, thinking you've demonstrated, you're already operating at the top of this curve. You just haven't been pricing or positioning yourself accordingly. The implications were starting to sink in. I hadn't been failing as a creative professional, I'd been succeeding while systematically undervaluing my own contributions. Now, let's talk about practical next steps, Victoria said. I've prepared 3 different scenarios for how you could develop your career from this point forward. Scenario 1 appeared on the screen: independent strategic design consultant. This path involves repositioning yourself as a strategic design consultant rather than a graphic designer. Minimum project fees of $15,000, focus on clients with annual revenues above $5 million, emphasis on business outcomes rather than creative outputs. Conservative projection, $200,000 annually within 18 months. Scenario 2. Pacific Digital Solutions Creative Director. Full-time position leading our Denver office creative team. Base salary, $120,000, plus equity participation and performance bonuses. You'd be managing projects for Fortune 500 clients, building and leading a creative team, learning agency operations at scale. Projected total compensation, $162,200 in the first year. Scenario 3. Hybrid partnership model. Maintain your independent practice for smaller clients while partnering with Pacific Digital on larger projects. You'd handle strategy and creative direction. We'd provide business development, project management, and account support. Revenue sharing model, potential earnings $250 to $350 annually. The numbers were almost absurd compared to where I'd been operating. 6 months ago, a $1,000 project had felt like a major victory. Now I was looking at scenarios that involved earning more in a month than I'd made in the previous year. Victoria: this is incredible, but I have to ask, are these projections realistic? They seem almost too good to be true. She smiled, but her expression remained serious. Marcus, let me show you something that might provide some context. The next slide showed a breakdown of Pacific Digital Solutions' annual revenue. $14.2 million. We're not a huge agency by industry standards, mid-sized, really. But we achieve this revenue by consistently delivering strategic value to clients who understand the business impact of professional creative work. Our average project fee is $38,000. She clicked to a client list that included names I recognized: national retail chains, technology companies, financial services firms. These clients don't pay premium rates because they're generous. They pay them because strategic design work generates measurable returns on investment. When we rebrand a company and their sales increase by 20%, a $50,000 creative investment becomes incredibly cost-effective. The business model was starting to make sense. I'd been thinking about design work as an expense for clients, when I should have been positioning it as an investment with quantifiable returns. But there's something else I want you to consider, Victoria said. The conversation at your family dinner revealed another issue that's common in creative careers: the isolation factor. She pulled up a new slide titled The Freelancer's Dilemma. Working independently, especially in creative fields, can create a distorted perspective on your own abilities and market value. You don't have peer comparison, industry mentorship, or access to higher-level opportunities. It's easy to get trapped in a cycle of undervaluing yourself because you're operating without proper context. The observation hit home. I'd spent 3 years working essentially in isolation, with no real understanding of how my work compared to industry standards or what established professionals were charging for similar services. That's one of the reasons I'm interested in bringing you into our organization, even if it's just as a consulting partner. Access to industry context, peer learning, and exposure to larger projects would accelerate your professional development significantly. Before I could respond, Victoria's assistant knocked on the conference room door. Victoria, David Hartley from Mountain Peak Brewing is on line 1. He says it's urgent. Victoria glanced at me with raised eyebrows. Would you mind if I took this call? David doesn't usually call with urgent matters. I nodded, and Victoria activated the speakerphone. David, I'm here with Marcus Garrison. What's going on? David's voice came through clearly, and he sounded excited. Victoria, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I had to share this news immediately. The distributor's response to our rebrand has been incredible. But something happened today that I think you both need to hear about. Victoria and I exchanged glances. What kind of response? We just got a call from Brewmaster's Choice, the national distribution network. They want to carry Mountain Peak in 1,500 locations across 8 states. The VP of Brand Development specifically mentioned our visual identity as a factor in their decision. He said we looked like a premium brand that could compete with established craft breweries. The news hit me like a physical sensation. Brewmaster's Choice was the kind of distribution deal that transformed regional breweries into national brands. David, that's fantastic news, Victoria said. What kind of volume are we talking about? Conservative estimate? This deal will increase our annual revenue by about 400%. We're looking at going from a $2 million regional operation to an $8 million national brand. I felt like the room was spinning. The rebrand I charged $8,000 for was directly contributing to a business transformation worth millions. But here's the thing, David continued. The Brewmaster's Choice team wants to meet with our brand development team to discuss the expansion strategy. They're specifically interested in talking to whoever created the visual identity system. Victoria looked at me with an expression that suggested she'd been expecting something like this. David, Marcus is sitting right here with me. Would you like to speak with him directly, Marcus? Perfect timing. Listen, I don't know if Victoria mentioned this, but the response to your work has been beyond our wildest expectations. The new branding isn't just helping us look more professional. It's opening doors we didn't even know existed. David's enthusiasm was infectious, but I was still trying to process the scale of what he was describing. The Brewmaster's Choice meeting is next Thursday, David continued. They want to understand our brand strategy, our expansion plans, and how we maintain visual consistency across different markets. Would you be available to join that conversation? I looked at Victoria, who was nodding encouragingly. Yes, absolutely. I'd be honored to be part of that meeting. Excellent. And Marcus, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but we've been talking internally about our expansion plans, and we'd like to retain you as our ongoing brand consultant. The visual identity you created is going to be the foundation for everything we do going forward. After David hung up, Victoria and I sat in silence for a moment, processing what had just happened. Marcus, Victoria said finally, do you understand? What just occurred? I was still trying to wrap my head around it. My $8,000 project just helped generate a $4 million business opportunity? More than that, Victoria said. You've just been invited to participate in a national brand expansion strategy meeting with one of the largest distributors in the country. 6 months from now, your work will be visible in 1,500 retail locations. She paused, letting that sink in. And David wants to retain you as an ongoing brand consultant for a company that's about to become 8 times larger than it was when you started working with them. The magnitude of the situation was starting to hit me. It wasn't just about the immediate financial opportunity, it was about the trajectory of my entire career. Victoria, what would ongoing brand consultation for a company like Mountain Peak typically be worth? She considered the question carefully. For a rapidly expanding company with national distribution, annual retainer fees typically range from $50,000 to $100,000, plus project-based work for specific campaigns and expansions. $50,000 to $100,000 annually. From one client, for work that I genuinely enjoyed and felt confident executing. But there's something else you should consider, Victoria said. Success stories like Mountain Peak generate industry attention. Other businesses see the results and want similar outcomes. David's success with your rebrand is going to become a case study that attracts higher-level opportunities. She pulled up a new document on the screen. I've been thinking about this since our conversation started. I'd like to propose something different from the 3 scenarios I outlined earlier. The new proposal was labeled Strategic Partnership with Accelerated Development. Instead of choosing between independent practice and agency employment, what if we created a customized arrangement that maximizes your growth potential while leveraging both your individual talents and our organizational resources? Victoria outlined a structure that was more sophisticated than anything I'd imagined. I would maintain my independent client relationships like Mountain Peak, while Pacific Digital Solutions provided business development support, strategic mentorship, and access to larger opportunities, revenue sharing on collaborative projects, but full ownership of clients I brought to the relationship. The goal would be to accelerate your transition from where you are now to where you could be in 3 years, running a premium creative consultancy that commands top-tier rates while working with nationally recognized clients. She clicked to a financial projection that showed potential earnings ramping from my current levels to over $400,000 annually within 3 years. Marcus, based on what happened with Mountain Peak, and based on the quality of strategic thinking you've demonstrated, I believe you have the potential to become one of the most successful creative consultants in the region. The question is whether you're ready to commit to that level of professional development. Looking at the projections, the client opportunities, and the support structure Victoria was offering, I realized that the conversation at Thanksgiving dinner had been more than just a family misunderstanding being resolved. It had been the moment when my career shifted from survival mode to genuine strategic growth. But perhaps more importantly, it had been the moment when I stopped accepting other people's limitations on what I could achieve and started believing in the value of what I was already creating. 6 months later, I was standing in the Brewmaster's Choice headquarters in Chicago, looking at a wall display featuring Mountain Peak's products alongside some of the most recognizable craft beer brands in the country. The visual identity I'd created for $8,000 was now generating millions in revenue and had become a case study that Victoria's team used to demonstrate the business impact of strategic design. But the real transformation wasn't in the numbers. It was in how I understood my own capabilities and value in the marketplace. The partnership arrangement with Pacific Digital Solutions had evolved into something neither Victory nor I had initially envisioned. Rather than simply providing support for my existing practice, we discovered that my strategic approach to brand development complemented their agency operations in ways that created entirely new opportunities. Marcus, the Brewmaster's Choice team, wants to discuss expanding beyond beer, David Hartley said as we walked through their corporate offices. They're looking at launching a premium spirits line, and they want the same team that developed Mountain Peak's brand strategy to handle the entire project. The spirits project represented a different scale of opportunity entirely. Instead of rebranding an existing business, we would be creating a new brand from scratch for national launch. Initial budget discussion had started at $250,000. $250,000. For a single project? 18 months earlier, I'd been celebrating $1,000 contracts. David, help me understand the scope, I said, pulling out the notebook I'd learned to carry to every client meeting. We're talking about brand strategy, visual identity, packaging design, and marketing materials for the full product line. All of that, plus retail positioning strategy, distributor materials, and digital marketing framework, David replied. Brewmaster's Choice wants to launch with the same level of brand sophistication that made Mountain Peak successful. But they want to do it from day one, instead of rebranding later. The complexity of the project was exactly the kind of challenge I'd learned to embrace. Working with Victoria's team had taught me that larger, more complex projects weren't just bigger versions of smaller work. They required entirely different approaches to strategy, team coordination, and client management. Marcus, there's something else, David continued. Brewmaster's Choice has been so impressed with the Mountain Peak results that they want to discuss bringing you on as their director of brand strategy. It would be a consulting role, not full employment, but they're talking about a 3-year agreement. Director of Brand Strategy for a national distribution company. The title itself represented a level of professional recognition I'd never imagined achieving. When I started working with Victoria 6 months earlier, we'd focused primarily on repositioning my existing practice and developing better business processes. But the success of Mountain Peak's national expansion had generated opportunities that were transforming my career trajectory in real time. The position would involve overseeing brand development for all their new partnerships, not just the spirits line, David explained. They're singing about 2 new craft breweries per month, and most of them need significant brand development work. 2 new breweries per month, each potentially representing projects worth tens of thousands of dollars. The mathematics of the opportunity were staggering. But more importantly, the role would position me as a strategic partner in business development rather than just a service provider. I'd be involved in evaluating potential partnerships, assessing brand development needs, and creating long-term growth strategies. David, what kind of time commitment are we discussing? I asked, trying to maintain professional composure while internally processing the magnitude of what he was describing. Probably 15 to 20 hours per week initially, with project spikes when we're launching new brands. The base consulting fee would be $12,000 monthly, plus project-based compensation for specific brand development work. $12,000 monthly. $144,000 annually. Just for the consulting retainer, before any project work combined with my other clients and the partnership projects with Pacific Digital Solutions, I was looking at annual earnings that exceeded what Victoria had projected in her most optimistic scenarios. The meeting concluded with David scheduling follow-up discussions with the brewmasters, his choice executive team, for the following week. As we walked back to the parking garage, he brought up something that had been on my mind as well. Have to ask, do you ever think about what would have happened if your father hadn't made those comments at Thanksgiving dinner? It was a question I'd been pondering for months. The evening that had seemed like such a devastating personal attack had actually become the catalyst for the most significant professional transformation of my life. Honestly, David, I think I would have continued undervaluing my work and operating in isolation. The conversation with Victoria forced me to confront how much I'd been limiting myself. But it was more than just the business education, I continued. Having someone with Victoria's industry credibility validate my work gave me the confidence to start pricing and positioning myself appropriately. Without that external validation, I might have continued the cycle of undercharging and struggling financially. David nodded thoughtfully. It's interesting how success can sometimes depend on having the right person recognize your value at the right moment. The drive back to Denver gave me time to reflect on how dramatically my life had changed. Not just financially, though the numbers were certainly life-altering. More fundamentally, my relationship with my work and my understanding of my professional identity had been completely transformed. Instead of feeling like I was barely surviving as a freelancer, I now understood myself as a strategic business consultant who happened to execute through design. Instead of apologizing for my career choices, I was being sought out by national companies for my expertise, but perhaps most importantly, the success had changed my relationship with my family. My father had become one of my strongest supporters, regularly referring potential clients and asking detailed questions about my projects. The shame and disappointment that had characterized our conversations about my career had been replaced by genuine pride and interest. When I arrived back in Denver, I had a voicemail from Victoria asking me to come by the office to discuss a new development. Given how rapidly opportunities had been materializing, I'd learned to respond to her requests immediately. Marcus, I just got off a call with the Chief Marketing Officer at Horizon Technologies, Victoria said when I arrived. At her office, they're a Fortune 500 company based in Austin. They're looking for someone to lead a complete brand overhaul project. Horizon Technologies, I recognized the name. They were a major player in enterprise software solutions with annual revenues in the billions. The project scope is substantial, Victoria continued. Complete visual identity redesign, marketing materials overhaul, digital presence reconstruction, and strategic positioning development. They're budgeting $800,000 for the initiative. $800,000. The number was so large it almost seemed abstract. But here's what makes this interesting, Victoria said. They specifically requested to work with the team responsible for the Mountain Peak success story. Your case study has been circulating in marketing circles. They want the same strategic approach applied to their rebranding challenge. The fact that my work was being discussed in Fortune 500 marketing departments still felt surreal. 18 months earlier, I'd been unknown outside of my small circle of local clients. Victoria, a project of that scale would require significant team support and project management infrastructure. I said, thinking through the practical implications. Exactly. Which brings me to something I've been considering for several weeks. Marcus, how would you feel about joining Pacific Digital Solutions as a partner rather than just a collaborator? Partnership. The word carried implications that went far beyond consulting arrangements or project collaborations. What would partnership involve? I asked. Victoria pulled out a folder that looked like it had been prepared by lawyers. Equity. Ownership in the company, profit sharing, strategic decision-making authority, and leadership of our brand strategy division. Essentially, you'd become a principal in the agency while maintaining the independence to pursue outside opportunities like the Brewmaster's Choice arrangement. She opened the folder, revealing documents that outlined a partnership structure I'd never imagined being offered. Based on the growth trajectory we've achieved together, based on the client demand for your specific expertise, I believe a partnership arrangement would benefit both of us significantly. You'd gain access to agency-level resources and opportunities, while we'd gain a proven strategic capability that differentiates us from our competitors. The proposal included equity percentages, profit-sharing formulas, and decision-making structures that would make me a genuine partner in a multi-million-dollar agency. But it also included something else that caught my attention, a provision for expanding our Denver operations to include a dedicated brand strategy division under my leadership. Victoria, this would involve hiring and managing a team. Initially, probably 3 to 4 strategic designers and brand consultants. As the division grows, potentially 10 to 15 people within 3 years, you'd be building and leading. The kind of team that could handle multiple Fortune 500 projects simultaneously, building and leading a team. Managing strategic operations for major corporate clients. Operating as a partner in an established agency while maintaining the independence to pursue individual opportunities, the career transformation that had started with my father's dismissive comments at Thanksgiving dinner was evolving into something I couldn't have imagined in my most ambitious moments. There's one more thing, Victoria said. I've been approached by 2 other agencies interested in acquiring our brand strategy capabilities. Not the entire company, specifically the strategic design approach we've developed through our collaboration. She handed me a summary document that outlined acquisition offers from agencies in Los Angeles and New York. The numbers were substantial, enough to represent financial security for life. I'm not interested in selling, Victoria continued. But the offers confirm that what we've built together has significant market value. A partnership arrangement would position both of us to benefit from that value long-term, rather than just accepting a one-time buyout. As I read through the partnership proposal, I realized that the conversation with my father 6 months earlier had set in motion a series of events that had completely redefined my professional trajectory. What had seemed like a devastating personal attack had actually been the catalyst for recognizing and claiming my actual market value. But the transformation went beyond just career success. The experience had taught me something fundamental about the difference between external validation and internal confidence. For years, I'd allowed other people's inability to understand my work to limit my own belief in its value. The success with Mountain Peak, the partnership opportunities with Pacific Digital Solutions, and the recognition from major corporate clients hadn't just changed my income, they'd changed my understanding of what was possible when I stopped accepting other people's limitations on my potential. Victoria, I need to ask you something, I said, looking up from the partnership documents. Do you think this level of success was always possible for me, or did something fundamental change in my approach? She considered the question carefully. Honestly, Marcus, I think you always had the capabilities to operate at this level. What changed was your context and positioning. Working in isolation, you didn't have access to the kind of opportunities that would demonstrate your actual value. Once you started operating in the right environment with appropriate support, your natural talents became visible to the right clients. She paused, then continued. But there's something else. The confidence you gained from early successes created a positive feedback loop. Better confidence led to better client relationships, which led to better projects, which led to even more confidence. Success became self-reinforcing. The observation resonated with my experience over the past 6 months. Each successful project had made the next one feel more achievable. Each client relationship had generated referrals and opportunities that would have seemed impossible earlier. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned to value my own work appropriately instead of apologizing for pursuing a creative career. "Victoria, I'd like to accept the partnership proposal," I said. "But I'd also like to suggest one modification." She raised her eyebrows with interest. "I'd like to establish a mentorship program for emerging creative professionals who are struggling with the same issues I faced, undervaluing their work, operating in isolation, lacking business context. Part of our success has come from recognizing untapped talent. I think there's an opportunity to systematize that recognition." Victoria's expression shifted to something approaching excitement. "Marcus, that's brilliant. A formal program for identifying and developing undervalued creative talent could become a significant competitive advantage for us. Plus, it addresses a real market need." She pulled out her phone and started making notes. "We could structure it as a combination mentorship and business development program. Identify talented freelancers who are underpricing themselves, provide business education, and industry context, then integrate the best candidates into our project teams." The idea felt like completing a circle. The conversation that had started with my father's dismissive comments about my career prospects was evolving into an opportunity to help other creative professionals avoid the same cycle of undervaluation and isolation that had limited my own growth for years. As I signed the partnership agreement that afternoon, I realized that the most significant transformation hadn't been financial or professional. It had been personal. I'd learned to believe in the value of my own work, to demand appropriate compensation for my expertise, and to operate with the confidence that came from understanding my place in the market. The Thanksgiving dinner conversation that had seemed so devastating 6 months earlier had actually been the beginning of the most successful period of my life. Sometimes the moments that feel like endings are actually just beginnings we haven't learned to recognize yet. 2 years after that Thanksgiving dinner, I found myself standing in front of a room full of creative professionals at the Denver Design Conference, delivering a keynote speech about strategic business development for independent creatives. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same person who had been publicly humiliated for pursuing a creative career is now being asked to teach others how to build successful creative businesses. But the real transformation became clear when I spotted my father in the audience, sitting in the third row with a notebook, taking detailed notes on my presentation about pricing strategies and client development. After my speech, he approached the stage with an expression I'd come to recognize over the past 2 years, genuine pride mixed with what looked like amazement at how our relationship had evolved. "Marcus, I have to tell you something," he said when the crowd had dispersed. "I've been thinking a lot about that Thanksgiving dinner, and I realize I owe you more than just an apology." We walked to a quiet corner of the conference center away from the networking crowds and vendor displays. "I've been watching what you've built over the past 2 years," he continued, "and I'm starting to understand that my criticism wasn't really about your career choices. It was about my own fears and limitations." The admission surprised me, not because it was unexpected, but because of how much our dynamic had shifted. 2 years earlier, I would have been desperate for this kind of acknowledgement. While I appreciated it, I no longer needed external validation to feel confident about my choices. "Dad, I understand why you were concerned," I said. "From your perspective, I was struggling financially and pursuing something that didn't look like traditional success." Your response made sense based on the information you had. "But that's just it," he replied. "I didn't actually have information. I had assumptions. I never took the time to understand what you were really doing or what the potential was. I just saw something that didn't match my model of how careers should work. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo he'd taken of one of my presentation slides. When you showed that progression from $8,000 projects to multi-million-dollar consulting agreements, I realized that you weren't just successful despite my doubts. You were building something I couldn't have imagined. The slide he'd photographed showed the financial trajectory of my business over the past 2 years. From barely surviving as a freelancer to generating over $500,000 annually through the combination of Pacific Digital Solutions partnership, individual consulting clients like Brewmaster's Choice, and the strategic design team I now led. But the numbers, while satisfying, weren't the most important part of the transformation. The real change was in how I approached my work and understood my value in the marketplace. "Dad, can I tell you something that might surprise you?" I said. That conversation at Thanksgiving dinner was probably the best thing that could have happened to my career. His expression shifted to confusion.
Ow.
"Is that possible?" I was completely wrong about everything. "You were wrong about the conclusions," I agreed. "But you forced me to confront some important questions about how I was positioning myself and what I was accepting as normal. Without that conversation, I might have continued undercharging and operating in isolation for years." The conversation with Victoria that had followed that dinner had been transformative, not just because she'd offered opportunities, but because she'd provided the industry context I'd been missing. Understanding that my work was actually competitive with major agencies, that my pricing was dramatically below market rates, and that my strategic approach was valuable to large corporations, none of that would have happened without the catalyst of that family confrontation. "Marcus, I need to ask you something," my father said. "Do you think there are other people like you, talented professionals, who are undervaluing themselves because they don't have the right context or support?" It was exactly the question that had led to the mentorship program Victoria and I had developed through Pacific Digital Solutions. Over the past 18 months, we'd worked with 43 creative professionals who were struggling with similar issues. Talented people who were pricing their services too low or operating without proper business development systems. Actually, Dad, it's incredibly common. The creative industries are full of people who have the technical and strategic skills to compete at high levels, but who lack the business knowledge or confidence to position themselves appropriately. I showed him another slide from my presentation, this one displaying the results of our mentorship program. The average participant had increased their annual income by 180% within 12 months. Not by working more hours, but by repositioning their services and targeting appropriate clients. The program works because it addresses the same issues I was facing, I continued. Most creative professionals are isolated, working without peer comparison or industry mentorship. They price based on their personal financial needs rather than market value. And they accept clients who treat creative work as a commodity rather than strategic investment. But when you provide proper business education, industry context, and support for developing appropriate client relationships, the results are dramatic. These aren't people who lack talent. They're people who lack positioning. My father was nodding thoughtfully, his business background helping him understand the market dynamics I was describing. "Marcus, this mentorship program, is it profitable?" Question revealed how much his thinking had evolved. 2 years earlier, he'd been focused on whether my career provided security and steady income. Now he was asking about the business model behind my efforts to help other creative professionals. "It's become one of our most successful initiatives," I replied. "We structure it as a combination of education and business development. Participants pay for the mentorship program, but we also have first access to partner with graduates who show exceptional potential. It's created a pipeline of talent for our agency while generating direct revenue from the educational components. More importantly, several of the program graduates had become independent success stories who are now generating referrals and collaborative opportunities. The network effect had created value that extended far beyond the direct financial returns. But there's something else," I continued. "The program has taught me that my experience wasn't unique. There are thousands of creative professionals who are capable of much more than they're achieving, simply because they're operating without proper support and context. We were interrupted by Victoria approaching with a woman I didn't recognize, professionally dressed, probably in her early 40s. With the kind of composed presence that suggested executive experience. "Marcus, I'd like you to meet Sarah Mitchell from Paradigm Ventures," Victoria said. "Sarah, this is Marcus Garrison, the partner I was telling you about. Paradigm Ventures. I recognize the name as one of the largest venture capital firms in the region, focused on scaling successful service businesses." "Marcus, I attended your presentation this morning," Sarah said, "and I'm very interested in discussing the expansion potential for your mentorship program in strategic design services." Q handed me a business card with impressive credentials. "Senior partner, portfolio development. We've been looking for opportunities in the creative services space, particularly businesses that have demonstrated scalable models for talent development and high-value client relationships. Based on what Victoria has shared about your partnership and what I observed in your presentation, I think there might be significant expansion opportunities. Venture capital interest. For a business that had started with me working alone in a studio apartment, barely making rent." "Sarah, what kind of expansion are we discussing?" I asked. "Regional franchise development for the mentorship program, acquisition of complementary creative service businesses, potentially national scaling of your strategic design methodology. We're looking at businesses that could grow from millions in annual revenue to tens of millions within 5 years. Tens of millions in annual revenue. Progression from my $8,000 Mountain Peak project to potential venture capital. Scaling seemed almost impossible to believe. But I'm particularly interested in the social impact component," Sarah continued. "A business model that generates profit while elevating the careers of undervalued professionals, has strong market appeal and significant growth potential." Victoria was watching the conversation with obvious satisfaction. The mentorship program had been my idea, but she'd provided the business infrastructure and scaling support that had made it successful. "Marcus, Sarah would like to schedule a formal presentation with our full team," Victoria said. "The investment discussion could accelerate our expansion timeline significantly." As Sarah handed me her contact information and scheduled follow-up meetings, I realized that the trajectory started by that Thanksgiving dinner conversation was still evolving in directions I couldn't have anticipated, but the most meaningful moment came when my father, who had been quietly observing the interaction with Sarah, pulled me aside after she left. "Marcus, I want you to know something," he said. "I've spent the past 2 years not just watching your career grow, but trying to understand how I could have been so wrong about your potential." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think the problem was that I was measuring your success against my own experience instead of trying to understand what you were actually building. I knew how to evaluate traditional businesses, but I had no framework for understanding creative professional services. The observation was more insightful than I'd expected." "What changed your perspective?" "Honestly, watching you work with clients. Seeing the results you generate, understanding the business impact of strategic design work, but also seeing how you've helped other people through the mentorship program. That's when I realized that what you do isn't just about making things look good. It's about solving complex business problems." He pulled out his notebook, the same one he'd been using during my presentation. "I've been taking notes because I'm trying to understand the principles behind what you've built. Not because I want to change careers," he added with a smile, "but because I want to be able to support what you're doing instead of questioning it." The gesture meant more to me than any of the financial successes or professional recognition I'd achieved. Having my father actively try to understand and support my work represented a complete transformation of our relationship. "Dad, can I ask you something?" I said. "Do you think you would have been more supportive if I'd been able to articulate the business value of my work better from the beginning?" He considered the question seriously. "Maybe. But I think the real issue was that I wasn't asking the right questions. Instead of trying to understand what you were doing and what the potential was, I was focused on whether it matched my preconceptions about career success. The truth is," he continued, "I was probably threatened by the fact that you were pursuing something I didn't understand. It's easier to dismiss something as impractical than to admit you don't have the knowledge to evaluate it properly. The admission revealed a level of self-awareness that had developed over the past 2 years of watching my career evolve. "But Marcus, there's something else I want to tell you," he said. "The success you've achieved isn't just about the business, opportunities, or the income growth. It's about the confidence and clarity you've developed. You operate with a level of professional authority now that you didn't have before." He was right. Transformation hadn't just been about external circumstances. It had been about internal confidence and professional identity. I no longer felt the need to apologize for pursuing creative work or to accept clients who didn't value my contributions. "The person who spoke on that stage today," my father continued, "wasn't just successful financially. He was someone who understood his value and could articulate it clearly to other people. It's leadership, not just business success." As we prepared to leave the conference, Victoria approached with news that would cap off what had already been an extraordinary day. "Marcus, I just received a call from the International Design Conference Organizing Committee," she said. "They want to invite you as the keynote speaker for their annual event in London. It's one of the most prestigious creative industry conferences in the world. It's typically reserved for heads of major agencies and established thought leaders." London, international keynote speaking, the progression from local freelancer to international thought leader in less than 3 years seemed almost surreal. "The topic they want you to address," Victoria continued, "is transforming creative careers through strategic business development, essentially sharing the methodology we've developed through the mentorship program and our partnership model. But the real significance wasn't in the professional recognition, it was in what the opportunity represented. The struggles I'd faced as an isolated freelancer, the family conflicts about my career choices, the financial uncertainties and professional doubts, all of it was being transformed into expertise that could help other people avoid similar challenges. That evening, driving home from the conference, I called the person who had made the entire transformation possible. "Victoria, I wanted to thank you for something that goes beyond the business partnership," I said when she answered. "What's that?" "That night at Thanksgiving dinner, you could have just politely listened to the family argument and moved on. Instead, you chose to speak up and share information that completely changed the trajectory of my career. That wasn't just professional networking, that was genuine mentorship at a moment when I needed it most." There was a pause before she responded. "Marcus, can I tell you something I've never mentioned before?" "Of course." That conversation at dinner reminded me of my own early career struggles. I spent years undervaluing my work and accepting clients who didn't respect my contributions. When I heard your father dismissing your career, I saw myself 20 years ago, and I realized I had an opportunity to provide the kind of support I wish I'd had. "But there's something else," she continued. "What you've built over the past 2 years has exceeded anything I imagined when I first offered you opportunities. The strategic thinking, the client relationships, the leadership of our brand strategy division, the mentorship program, you've created something that benefits not just your own career, but the entire creative industry." As I ended the call and pulled into my driveway, the driveway of the house I'd been able to purchase 18 months earlier, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that Thanksgiving dinner. The studio apartment had been replaced by a 3-bedroom house with a dedicated home office. The financial stress had been replaced by investment planning and tax strategy discussions. The family embarrassment had been replaced by pride and support. But most importantly, the apologetic uncertainty about my career choices had been replaced by confidence in my professional value and excitement about future possibilities. The conversation that had seemed like such a devastating attack on my dreams had actually been the catalyst for recognizing and claiming those dreams at a level I'd never imagined possible. Sometimes the moments that feel like endings are just beginnings we haven't learned to recognize yet. And sometimes the people who challenge us most forcefully are the ones who push us toward the transformation we didn't know we needed. That Thanksgiving dinner had taught me that success isn't just about having talent or working hard. It's about understanding your value, positioning yourself appropriately, having the confidence to demand what you're worth. But perhaps most importantly, it's taught me that the opinions of people who don't understand your work can only limit you if you let them. The moment you stop accepting other people's limitations on your potential is the moment you start building something extraordinary. 2 years later, as I prepared for international speaking engagements, managed a team of strategic designers, and helped dozens of other creative professionals transform their careers, I realized that my father's harsh words at that family dinner had been the greatest gift he could have given me. They had forced me to prove him wrong, not to him, but to myself. And in proving him wrong, I had discovered who I really was and what I was actually capable of achieving. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.